Good afternoon. I'm Mabel Barrison, the director of the Institute for European Studies at the Einaudi Center for International Studies. And I want to welcome you to the Luigi Einaudi Distinguished Chair Lecture, and to welcome our speaker, Michèle Lamont, who is Professor of Sociology and of African American Studies, and the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. Before introducing Professor Lamont more fully, I want to say a few words about who Luigi Einaudi was and how this lectureship came to be. So, the post-fascist and democratic constitution of Italy was ratified by the Italian Parliament on January 1, 1948. And on May 12, 1948, Luigi Einaudi, a liberal economist, became the first president of the Italian Republic. He served for 7 years. The Einaudi family was reasonably wealthy and an established bourgeois family in Turin, and were able to navigate living in Italy during the fascist period. Luigi's son Mario was a dedicated anti-fascist, so he was less willing to sit out the fascist years in Italy. He came to the United States first as a professor of politics at Fordham University, and then he moved to Cornell, where he served as professor in our government department from the mid-1940s until his retirement in 1972. During that period, the Einaudi family endowed the Luigi Einaudi Chair and provided an endowment for the Institute for European Studies, of which we are very grateful. In 1994, Cornell renamed International Studies after Mario and the Einaudi family. It just so happens, just a historical footnote here, that this Friday, April 25th, marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Italy from the Nazis. Liberation Day, as the Italians call it. And we are 2 weeks or a little more short of May 8th, which is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. In many ways, our center was born from the ashes of World War II and the hope for democracy. Yet today, we are facing challenges to democracy that would have been unimaginable in the optimistic moments of 1945. Today, democracy is challenged all over the globe, and even remarkably here in the United States. For this reason, our principal theme at the Institute during my tenure has been threats to democracy in Europe and the United States. It is also a major theme of Cornell and also of Cornell University and the Einaudi Center in general. Having said that, it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Michèle Lamont. Her research is particularly suited to helping us think about our historical moment. Professor Lamont is the founder, according to me, but others I would agree, I'm sure, of the field of comparative cultural sociology and ethnographic political sociology. She is a true comparativist, talking to her research subjects in Europe and beyond, asking them to articulate their feelings of inclusion and exclusion, and to describe how they draw boundaries between themselves and others. Her research is crucial for understanding the subjective side of political preference and important for understanding the motivations between how people understand themselves in the political world. This is crucial for our understanding of the pulls and pushes of democracy. Professor Lamont has a daunting array of accomplishments that I will try to do justice to in this brief introduction. She grew up in Quebec and studied political theory at the University of Ottawa before obtaining a doctorate in sociology at the University of Paris. After completing postdoctoral research at Stanford, she served on the faculty of the University of Texas at Austin, Princeton University, and then on to Harvard in 2003. She has researched how we evaluate social worth across societies, the role of cultural processes in fostering inequality, symbolic and social boundaries, and the evaluation of knowledge, as well as topics such as dignity, stigma, racism, class cultures, collective well-being, social resilience, and social change. As I said, this is daunting, but I will go on for a bit more. Her books include Money, Morals, and Manners, The Culture of the French and Upper Middle Class, upper middle class, The Dignity of Working Men, Morality and the Boundaries of Race, Class, and Immigration, How Professors Think, I like that, Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment, Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the US, Brazil, and Israel, and most recently, Seeing Others, How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. She's also the author of several collective works, over 100 peer-reviewed articles published in leading journals. She has served as the 108th president of the American Sociological Association. She was director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. She is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Royal Society of Canada, and the British Academy. Her honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Carnegie Fellowship, or Leverhulme Fellowship, and a 2017 Erasmus Prize from the Netherlands, as well as a 2024 Coley Prize for Sociology. She has received 6 honorary doctorates. She has spent this last year on leave in Europe and beyond. She's been traveling, and she'll, I'm sure, tell us about that. And she will talk about her current projects, Seeing Others, the ongoing challenge of recognition gaps in the United States and Europe. Please join me in welcoming Michèle Lamont to our center and to Cornell.
Hi, everyone. Is this working? Yes. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Mabel, for this very nice introduction. Mabel and I have been friends since I think we met in 1987 when I was spending a summer at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. And she's been a wonderful companion in this world of comparative and cultural sociology. She's written a number of really smart and thoughtful books and articles. So I'm really grateful that you invited me here today, Mabel, for this important lecture. And I'm sorry to hear that Liberation Day has happened before. And actually, as you were saying this, it made me realize, yes, Trump appropriated this term, which has a noble past. But anyway, you won't be able, collective memory will not associate it with him for long, I'm sure. So I'm going to talk to you about this book, but before I do this, I want to give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to literally give you a pretty superficial understanding of what this book, which came out in September of 2023 on recognition, and I'll explain to you how I'm building on it in my current work, which involves a comparison of Manchester, New Hampshire, and the greater Manchester, UK. But since we started this project, someone from Finland came to us and said, temporary Finland is the Manchester of Finland. Can I join your project? So now it's the Three Manchester Project. And also I'll talk a little bit about the recognition gap in Europe between urban and rural places, since after all, this is a lecture series on Europe. So I thought I would add this to add more of a comparative dimension to my presentation. But to start with this book, I like to explain a little bit the context in which I had the idea of writing this book. It came up in the context of the first Trump presidency, where, like many people, I was depressed, and I decided to read the literature in sociology on where to find hope. And what this literature tells us is that exposures to narrative, to alternative narrative about what the future could look like is really important to being able to imagine alternatives. So, and as a cultural sociologist, of course, we study cultural production and diffusion. So I felt like, okay, let's focus on the people whose job it is to produce alternative narrative in this moment where, you know, after 2008, many millennials felt like the American dream was totally out of reach. Gen Zs were in the midst of a very major mental health crisis. There was many people had the sense that, you know, this is even before the pandemic, that we're all grappling for, you know, new models of thinking about the future. So this is the context, and I was really interested in thinking sociologically about hope. So, and you will see the project ended up being very helpful, and I hope that one thing you're going to get out of my talk is really even a sense of hope for today in the situation in which we are, which is very much something we all need. But this is not blah, blah, blah. You know, I think we can really think sociologically about the conditions, the cultural, structural conditions under which hope is produced, and why we have reasons to think that the future is not as gloomy as we could imagine. So the book came out simultaneously in the US and the UK, and I like to show the two covers because the British cover from Penguin as the right title, this is exactly what the book is about, how to redefine worth in a divided world, whereas the subtitle of the American version published by Simon & Schuster is something I really don't like because they insisted on putting in the subtitle how it can heal a divided world because they wanted to be able to advertise the book in the self-help section of Amazon, which is clearly not something I was very fond of because my argument is kind of anti-self-help, but you will see. But on the other hand, the book cover, the design of the American version is very much to my liking because this is exactly what the book is about. It's about, you know, the circle of people who feel that they matter, who feel that they are worthy, who feel that they have cultural membership, and different groups of different size are further or closer to the center, feel that they belong or not belong. And the challenge of the book in giving hope was really to try to explain to the general audience how it is that through our action, we can contribute to broadening the circle of those who feel that they belong. At Harvard, I have colleagues, Dan Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, who had, I think it's in 2017, published a book, How Democracy Dies, which was extremely successful at drawing on their deep professional expertise as, you know, people who had spent their lives studying authoritarianism in Latin America and in Europe, to really simplify and explain to the general audience how it is that authoritarianism flourishes. And in my mind, as I was seeing everything that Trump was doing, you know, you will remember, those of us who are old enough, as soon as he was elected, he passed this ban, the travel ban against 7 Muslim countries, and then he started his attacks against trans people and LGBTQ. And of course, me as a student of boundaries, I felt like he's doing it, you know, and that's exactly what he's doing again now, when you think that he has decided to cut the funding to K-12 schools in Maine because they're not prohibiting trans athletes from competing. So is, you know, law, so much of what is happening in DC has to do with symbolic ordering and picking orders or using resources to create new hierarchies and to signaling to his base that that's exactly what he's doing, thus responding for their wishes. So I felt like, okay, cultural sociologists have the tools to make sense of all these things, but the general audience doesn't necessarily. People are just experiencing these things as they happen without a framework. So the objective of the book was, in fact, to make that vocabulary accessible. So I would say that the book is very much written as a pedagogical exercise in the sense that there are some new findings in there, but the primary goal of the book was more to an exercise in public sociology, but one that is deeply empirically grounded, as you will see. So the context, the broader social context, was one of an explosion of social movements that were making recognition claims, that were led by groups on the left and the right of the political spectrum that felt very much like their dignity was disrespected. Things about Black Lives Matter or Me Too, that they were being discriminated against, that they were treated unfairly, and they mobilized, they take the street to protest. And they all ask for recognition. This is true also of the MAGA movement that is often associated with working class people who feel like they've been displaced from their role as the backbone of American society and are now very much devalued, disregarded, and they're embracing and elevating their high identity as Americans as a way to counter this feeling that they have. And in Europe, you have the farmers the farmers movement in the Netherlands and other countries took the street to claim also that their interests were disregarded, not only by their country, but also by Europe through many of the policies that were being placed. So I'll talk about this at the end. So what's behind all this? So the question we ask ourselves in the context of all these struggles is really, where do the scripts of self come from? What is the cultural side by which people come to think about who is valued in our society? And how are the shared scripts we have through which we think about these questions produced and diffused? And how can we change the balance between the kind of scripts that we have access to? Here you have blank panthers. The reason I'm showing you this slide is that for this study, my research assistant and I interviewed during the pandemic 185 cultural producers, which includes a number of people working in Hollywood as Hollywood creatives. And one of the people we interview is someone named Channing Dunghae. When I interviewed her on Zoom, she was in charge of international programmation on Netflix. So you can imagine the cultural power that this person had, to decide what's going to be projected worldwide. And she is the person who, African-American woman, very much committed to providing recognition to people of color. And she explained to me that this was motivating a lot of what she was doing. Of course, Netflix is not a nonprofit organization. She had to make money somehow, but she also had convictions, passions having to do with the promotion of social justice. And she told me how important it was for her to be able to make Black Panther available to kids in Africa and to young people in India. That was not always the white people who were going to be their heroes. So that's an example of a script of people who are, the story, probably know it, presenting really this African community as the winners of a society and people who are courageous and able to overcome adversity and rich and culturally and historically, celebrated society. So that's an example of what the kind of narrative that the people who we interviewed talked to us about their work, and you will see in a second, many other similar narratives were provided. So it's a study of the public sphere. And in order to study it, we identified 185 interviewees, who we call agents of change, who work in a number of cultural industries, organizational fields, which includes not only, Hollywood creative, but also people in the philanthropy, people who play a very important role in scaling up narratives. And we have a subsample of 75 stand-up comics in Hollywood creative. I'll give you some findings from this part of the study in a second. But we wanted to study not only how meaning is produced from the top down, but also from the bottom up, which is why we did 80 interviews with college students in the Midwest and the Northeast, Gen Zs. We interviewed them before the pandemic and during the pandemic. I didn't do these interviews myself because they're really, really pissed at boomers. They would not have talked to me. So I had 2 graduate students who look very young do these interviews, and it worked really well. So, and for the agents of change, since it was the pandemic, everyone was at home. So we were able to interview a lot of really famous people. If you get hold of the book, you will see the appendix is quite interesting. So a couple of definitions before I get into the findings. So, you know, there's a long history of research on recognition. Hegel, the dialect of the slave of the master, for instance. There's literature that is mostly coming out of philosophy. People like Nancy Fraser and Alex Honneth are very famous for their debate around the politics of recognition and distribution, which has to do with identity politics and whether politics should be about distributing resources or giving voice to groups that feel underrepresented. So he defines recognition as a social act by which the positive social worth of an individual or a group is affirmed or acknowledged by others. So what's important here is it's a social act, it's a social accomplishment that is done in collaboration. It has to be, dignity is given to you intersubjectively. You cannot just say I'm worthy. There's an element of confirmation. And that's very much in line with the basic theories about social identity, the work of Richard Jenkins, for instance, that tells us, how do you know what your identity is? It's both through self-identification, who I think I am, but also group categorization, what others tell you you are. And that goes on and on, always as we lead our lives. It's an intersubjective cultural process that is happening like an unintended consequence of us coexisting together. The counterpart is stigmatization, a concept that many of you have encountered, Irving Goffman, of course, the process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. And those two things are happening at the same time, and the result is something we can call cultural membership, how social actors understand themselves as similar or different from one another, and accompanying understanding and social obligation entailed in these relationships of similarity and differences. So to give you a concrete example, I'm French Canadian. I grew up during the 60s at the time when there was a very important nationalistic movement going on there, which was really a movement of affirming the cultural value of Quebec culture against English Canadians who had a lot of stereotypes about French Canadians. And it was a moment of cultural explosion, very much like the Black movement in the United States in the 60s as a moment of self-affirmation with a lot of artistic production, film, and also claim for autonomy, which resulted over time with a real transformation in the collective identity perceived and experienced of this group. You can trace that through surveys, the same way that you can trace the transformation of stereotypes about African Americans over time. So this is about the transformation of group boundaries, which is one of my topics on which I've written a lot. And that's a topic that is very urgent today because you have people like Jonathan Haidt, a psychologist at NYU, who's written a lot about tribalism. And he says that we are, quote unquote, wired to like people who are like us and to dislike people who are not like us. So it's kind of essentialism that is connected to human nature. I don't believe in human nature at all. I believe that, and that's what I just told you, collective definition of identities are produced, you know, socially, and they can be changed. And there are moments when group boundaries are very rigid, and there are moments where they can be made permeable. And I study the conditions under which this happened. And the book's goal is to explain to people what they can do to help make group boundaries more permeable. So it's an anti-human nature book, basically. And the anti, you know, you've heard it in the media. There's tons of books now that talk to us about how we are wired to the point where our graduate students or our undergrads are just talking about we're all wired to do this or that, which is something that I'm obviously fighting against as a sociologist. So here I'm building on a collaboration that I've been involved in for 19 years with a group of social scientists from across discipline called Successful Societies. We were funded by a Canadian organization to meet 3 times a year for 19 years. And what we wanted to do, to go on my, you know, anti-psychology rant, is really to respond to this notion of individual grit that you've also been exposed to, which is very much about the capacity of individuals to pull themselves by their bootstraps. So it's very much approaching grit as a personality trait there. It's very much, at the center of the way this concept has been made available in the public sphere. And instead of that, we can think about the role of institutions and cultural repertoires in giving us the tools that we need as members of groups to build social resilience, which is very different. And that's where the role of narrative is important, because narratives provide to groups the tools to think of themselves differently. So an example is the adoption of same-sex marriage laws, which were correlated with a quite rapid decline in the number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in college. So of course, these laws were not passed to affect, the mental health of young people, but it had this as an unintended consequence. So it's an example of the power of narrative in affecting social resilience, defined as the capacity of groups and societies to meet the challenges that come their way. So it's about the effect of culture and the conditions for fostering dignity, which is as important to well-being as is money. There's a book called The Science of Dignity that came out 2 years ago by Anderson and Steve Hilton, which is exactly about that, looking at tons of evidence showing that in order to flourish as a person, you need to have both dignity and income. So it's also, if you want, a dialogue with economics as a discipline to help us move toward a much more multidimensional understanding of human beings. So, since this is also, there's a number of sociologists in the room, I'll just make a little parenthesis here to say that this is part of a very multi-dimensional approach to studying inequality, a field that has often been focused on material resources. That's what the politics of distribution is about. But in fact, if you want to understand dignity, I would argue, and I've written about this, we need to think about this as a multi-dimensional phenomenon that involves not only material resources, who has what, but also processes where culture comes in. So this is evident when you look at the type 1 processes. If you take a class in the sociology of inequality, you will learn about exploitation and domination when you read Marx, the notion of surplus value, for instance. You will read about closure and opportunity hoarding when you read Weber. So these are two cases where symbolic boundaries, distinctions based on how people behave, and it determines who can monopolize resources. The type 2 is a line of research that exploded since the 1980s, associated with the name Pierre Bourdieu, who talked about social, cultural, and economic capital. So types of resources that are contributing to placing people in hierarchy. But the kind of process that I'm interested in have to do with racialization, recognition, identification, and stigmatization that are ongoing processes, that are cultural processes that are ongoing as we lead our lives. So this leads us toward a very multi-dimensional understanding of how inequality is produced. That comes through a number of processes, and all of us sociologists are kind of studying different parts of this, if you will, okay? So this is also a call for a very methodological pluralism being at the center of our discipline. I think one of the distinctive strengths of sociology is precisely that we have a multiplicity of paradigm, and we're able to approach inequality from many different perspectives at once, which is a strength. And closing the parenthesis, these are some of the papers that I wrote, especially the first on what is missing cultural processes and the making of inequality. That is really about, spelling out what this approach to inequality can contribute to the discipline. Okay, so now, this is just, FYI. So now going back to the book, I'll just touch very quickly on a couple of points about how is it that we can work toward making group boundaries more permeable and broadening the circle of people who are viewed as mattering or belonging. So in the book, I focus on 3 different processes. The first one is moving from a unidimensional understanding of who's worthy, which can be described as neoliberal. You'll see this in a second. A second one is focusing on ordinary universalism, what all human beings have in common. And the third one is really about stigma reduction, cases where people have been historically stigmatized and are not stigmatized anymore. I'll give the case of people with HIV/AIDS to illustrate this. So these scripts of self, there's a very important school in sociology that has written about this. Actually, David Strang, who teaches here, is part of this line of research. John Myers associated with the idea that you have widely institutionalized, taken for granted templates that we have through which we think about who's worthy. After 4 decades of growing inequality across all advanced industrial societies, the kind of definition of worth that we share, that the large proportion of the population shares, is the notion that we should be highly successful, that we're measured in terms of level of education, income, our ability to consume, that we should also be self-reliant, not depend on the state, this notion of privatization of risk. We should be competitive. And meritocracy is very much at the center of this, because meritocracy is presumed to be rewarding people who are hard workers and who are persistent. While in fact, my kids have 2 parents who have PhDs. They're born on an escalator. We all know that meritocracy, in some ways, yes, rewards hard work, but in so many ways, it's also an ideology that is kind of a lie, because there's such inequality in the sandbox in which we play that, in fact, it's very difficult to think about people's success as really correlated with their efforts, right? So we have to bring back inequality. But what we know, in the longer version of this talk, I show the work of Jonathan Maisch that shows that between 1930 and today, the extent to which people believe in meritocracy has grown exponentially in all advanced industrial societies. Out of those 24 societies that he looks at, there's only 4 of them where people don't believe in meritocracy. So it's an ideology that has become increasingly consolidated, and it's particularly dangerous because with it comes growing bifurcation in our understanding of who's worthy. Who are the people who are worthy? They're people like us in this room, people who have college degrees, people who are successful, people who are going to become professional and be able to consume and be able to have children who will do the same thing. And those who are not worthy are people who don't have a college degree, who are stuck, who cannot think of their life as a project of moving forward toward, leading a life where it's like a ladder that you progress. And those people, who are more than 50% of the population, over the last decades have been repeatedly submitted to cultural narratives that tell them that they're not worthy. So there's a media expert, Richard Bush, who has done a content analysis of all the entertainment television shows for these decades, most of them that are available. And he shows that during these decades, when you watch TV, all the heroes are people like us, professionals and managers. And the workers, it's very hard for them to find heroes that look like them. When you see a working class person, it's normally a fool. Think of Bart Simpson, the dad, he's a moron, he's a clown, no one wants to look like him, right? So, and this message is repeated, and when you think about, the economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton have written about death by despair, about how so many Americans have had, growing problems with substance abuse, and also the mental health crisis that has characterized a growing number of upper middle class youth. All of us who teach students, we know how much time now we're spending dealing with the mental health of our students instead of educating them. It's been a national epidemic. And that has to do with it's often explained as the effect of parents telling their kids, yeah, you better stay with the program. But the kids get the message that if they're not successful, they're not lovable. So that creates a lot of tension. And this is all a response to this unidimensional model of worth that we're being exposed to. So we have to think about how to diversify our model of worth so that people who perform different kind of roles can also think of themselves as worthy. So that's kind of the background of the book. The first 2 chapters are downers. You read these chapters and you think, oh God. But it explains how the college degree has come to operate as a caste divide in our society. So people talk about the diploma divide as really driving so much of the problem that our societies have. So what are the solutions? Then to think about solution, we can look at these cultural producers. So one of the papers we have, which is actually now forthcoming in Work on Occupation, looks at our 75 stand-up comics and Hollywood producers. We were super lucky because all the graduate students wanted to work on this project, as you would imagine, like Bill Hader, Michael Schur, produced Park and Recreation and The Good Life. We had access to the guy who produced The Handmaid's Tale, all the queer guys, the Queer Eye. So one of the things we did in his paper is create a typology as we interviewed all these comics and Hollywood producers about what they do in their work. And a lot of what they're doing is kind of trying to move us away from a model of what our life should look like that's focused on the American dream toward one that emphasizes instead inclusion and authenticity. Our ability to lead the life that we want to lead in line with who we think we are, and so that we can lead our best life today. So it's really, in some ways, in a context where the American dream is not working for so many people, a lot of those people are really embracing instead values that have to do with authenticity and inclusion. So some of the respondents talked to us about how they're doing this. So it would mean, for instance, expanding visibility for groups that are not sufficiently present on our screen. People of color, LGBTQI, other groups that have been underrepresented, like domestic workers. So one strategy was described to us as the Trojan horse strategy. So one of the respondents said, my goal is to make people laugh. I'm not paid to force people to eat their vegetables. Instead, what we're trying to do is make them laugh. But as I tell my jokes, I also pass on little messages like, let's make fun of the racist. And a lot of what comedy is today is about this kind of recognition work that is produced. That once you think about this, you realize when you watch shows, you can see it happening all the time. A lot of what they talked about is also to try to help us move from stereotypical and bidimensional views of who people are toward a much more multidimensional view that humanizes people, that describe them in a way that honors their dignity, that correspond to the way that they want to be seen. So it's really, they talk about cultural work in a very, very subtle and complex ways. So for instance, I interviewed Joy Soloway, who created the show Transparent. And it's the story of an advanced middle-aged woman who becomes trans late in life, and she has to negotiate her relationship with her adult children. And Joy Soloway told me, well, my goal is really to make a trans person less abhorrent, more understandable. So the words I'm using here are words that you find time and time again throughout our interviews. So the book talks about, I propose this, there's another video that I mentioned in the book, which is a video that was used to, in the school, the producer, Hank Willis Thomas, created this video where he interviewed 125 Black men across the country and asked them, what does it feel like to be a Black man? And he found enormous diversity in their experience, but they said, the one thing they all share is this experience of dealing with microaggression. And then he connected with an organization called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which has over 2,000 organizations throughout the country that took this video and diffused it in high school and community centers to create discussions around that. So what we have is a mix and a collaboration between the cultural producers who all over the place are creating these new narratives. When I'm mentioning the show Transparent, some of you might know about it, and you know what is the content, and you recognize it as providing recognition to these groups that are stigmatized. But they work hand in hand with organizations, often philanthropic organizations, that play an important role in scaling up the message. So the Ford Foundation, for instance, sponsored a film called Roma, which was showed on Netflix, which tells the story of domestic workers in Mexico City. One of them decides to have an abortion. So when I interviewed a woman named Agent Pooh, who's a leader in the Domestic Workers Union in the US about this film, she was a collaborator in putting this film together. She said our goal was really to make people understand domestic workers in a much more multidimensional way, to see them as human. And so this is like the kind of, the whole philanthropic industry became focused on what the Ford Foundation's president, Darren Walker, calls capturing hearts and minds. When he became president of this foundation, which is one of the largest in the US, he said, my objective is to fight inequality. I'm going to do it through 4 pillars, and one of them is through the transformation of narratives. And that's very important because in the world of policy, historically, economists were very central and had a monopoly. It had to do with there was a big project called Moving to Opportunity, which was about, taking low-income people, putting them in new neighborhood. So a lot of it was about engineering structural conditions in which people lived. But with this move in the last decade or so, a lot of philanthropies became very actively involved in transforming narrative. So, all of this adds up, as you will see in a minute. And it has to do with moving us away from simply thinking about who's valued in terms of socioeconomic achievement toward making a lot more ways, a lot more scripts available to think about who's worthy and who contributes. So that's a first strategy. I have to time myself here. A second one would be to think about how stigma is reduced. So here I'm referring to a paper I co-authored with graduate students who are now famous sociologists. People living with HIV/AIDS would be a success, an example of a group that used to be deeply stigmatized, that is not stigmatized at all anymore, as we show in our article. And whereas people who are obese were very stigmatized 30 years ago, and they're still stigmatized. So how did that happen? So we look at detailed studies, like Abigail Sagi was swung with fat, and Stephen Epstein has a book on the transformation of the meaning of HIV/AIDS, and we showed that there's a number of social actors who are knowledge workers, social scientists, legal expert, medical expert, journalists, who were very influential in transforming the meaning of AIDS, showing, for instance, that it's not a disease that's stigmatized because it's the disease of gay men who spend too much time in public restroom having sex with random people, that in fact anyone can get AIDS. So this movement toward destigmatizing morally the disease, but also you had public figures like Magic Johnson, who publicly said, I have AIDS, strong athlete, or Lady Di, who came from the UK, and she removed her gloves and was photographed shaking the hands of people with AIDS. So it's literally a social process that can be documented step by step. And they're not doing this out of nothing. They're drawing on existing ideologies that surround them, which we resist in destigmatizing outcomes. And Abigail Sagi, in her book, What's Wrong with Fat, kind of shows that these things are just not happening for obesity. But the point here is to say, yes, boundaries can be changed. They are being changed all the time. And if we understand how destigmatization happens, it can happen more. And the other part of the book is really about what Gen Zs think. And Gen Zs are really interesting because they've had it. They think that boomers really screwed up. So they create a new world in their head. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room are Gen Zs. So we did these interviews with 80 of them to try to understand how they understand the social problems that we have now, and what are their conceptions of a better future, and how they think about hope. And when we look at the cultural repertoires that they draw on to think about their own lives, we argue that what they're doing is braiding. They don't entirely abandon the American dream. You know, they're young Americans, so they think that, okay, you have to be agentic and entrepreneurial, and you have to put your life together. But at the same time, they're very critical of the American dream because they really want to balance work and mental health and work and life. So people of my generation, we didn't know about mental health. We didn't know it existed. So we were just working like beasts, but they're not going to do that. They're much wiser. But also they combine this with this notion of ordinary universalism. And that was very salient when we did these interviews, where they were really trying to make abstraction of, you know, whatever status people had, to say, well, I want to relate to people with who they really are. And they really embrace, like, for instance, what became known as woke culture, like if embracing the non-binary restroom, non-binary pronouns. A lot of what became known as woke culture is very much what defines what this ordinary universalism is about. It is to say we relate to each other as people, and we don't care about the rest, and you should be allowed to lead a life you want without, you know, being discriminated against. So they were very much advocates of this. And we have another paper that compares the middle class and the working class Gen Zs, and we show that they think about these things very differently. The middle class kids don't talk about class at all. They're very supportive of people of color and LGBTQI, but they don't talk very much about low income people. And during the pandemic, of course, the working class kids were busy helping their family paying bills, whereas the middle class ones wanted to be the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement. So why is it helpful at the end? Well, in the paper on stand-up comics, we reconstruct how our stand-up comics think about the changes. And basically, it's really like 1,000 points of light, a metaphor that Bush used to talk about, you know, philanthropy in America. Well, they talk about 1,000 points of, you know, new narratives being planted out there that trickle down or trickle out or redefine how we think about the world. And altogether, they add up, you know. That's exactly what they think they're doing. And I think it's basically how it works. And during the pandemic, we ended up with a lot of lawns having posters like this year in response to, you know, a lot of what happened, you know, as a proclamation of support toward undocumented immigrants. So I think this language of solidarity really diffused in many ways. And now you might think, what is she talking about? You know, look at what Trump is doing today. There's a tug of war here, and there's a lot of backlash against this discourse of inclusion that I've been talking about. So for sure, this is a little list of what Trump has been up to since January 20th. So it's easy to come up with a list of many kinds of interventions that he's done that are doing just the opposite of what I've been talking about. I've been focusing on agents of change on the progressive and liberal side of the political spectrum, but you have the Joe Reagan and the Jordan Peterson and the, you know, I could go on and on. So for sure, it's a tug of war to define what's happening in the public sphere. But the reason this book and my research, I think, is providing us tools for hope is that these narratives that I'm talking about are still going on, are still being produced. And actually, I have a paper that just came out today in Salon with Dan Cornfield, who is a labor sociologist. And it's a paper that where we talk about the reaction to Trump's attack against the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we describe precisely the recognition chains, all the groups. We say that these changes are going to have a deep impact, negative impact in rural America, in the red states, where so many people are dependent on these organizations to, you know, to do their work. And we describe, you know, all the groups that are now involved in fighting this. So yes, the resistance has taken a lot of time to really grow, and it still has a long way to go. But we can see many, many networks emerging, and certainly over the last few weekends, we've seen also multiplication of demonstration. So this is for, the title of the book is also, a call for action. So, and where can we find hope? So that's one element of answers that I'm going to bring to you. Okay, now I'm going to quickly change gear. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do everything I intended to do, but if not, we will see. So now I'm working and being on leave this year. I called it my traveling sabbatical because, spending a lot of time in different places, including Hong Kong and Abu Dhabi. But now I'm working on this 3 Manchester project. The book will be about paths of recognition, how people are seeking recognition through politics, with a focus on this invisible working class, young workers 18 to 30. So the previous book, Seeing Others, was focused on the Gen Zs, who are very progressive overall. But in fact, the non-college educated in this age group are not progressive. And we know that Trump has made major effort through the manosphere to reach out to these mostly young men who feel like DEI really screwed them. 38% of men in the college-educated age group have college degrees compared to more than 50% for women. So they feel very much that they have been left, they've been penalized with this politics of recognition that I've just talked about. So we focus on working class youth 18 to 30 in Manchester, New Hampshire, and Manchester, UK. Both cities were at the center of the Industrial Revolution in the UK and the US. I mentioned here Indigenous people, but I'm not going to talk to you about this today because I don't have time. But we're looking at how they're seeking recognition through work and environmental justice in Canada and the US. So Manchester, New Hampshire, you know where it is. I don't need to explain to you. But the question we ask is, are they seeking recognition through politics? If so, how? And how much is their political orientation toward politics shaped by their class identity or place identity? In other words, do they know anything about the history of Manchester, New Hampshire, which was the largest center for textile production in the world at some point early in the 20th century, and which had enormous strikes, and where the fight around child labor was led? It's, like Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, that's where those fights happen, and also the fight for, women's vote and many other things. The counterpart, you can see these buildings in red brick. Well, the same thing you have in Manchester, UK. The two of them were very much connected. That's the place where the textile was very much produced before the end of slavery in the US. They did a major strike to decide to stop using the cotton from the South during the Civil War. And then, so I have collaborators there, Andrew Miles and Hilary Pilkington, and I'm now there at the University of Manchester for 3 months, and we're in the process of doing well, actually not me. They are in the process of doing interviews with young workers, parallel, research design in Oldham, which is Greater Manchester, just as we did interviews in the Greater Manchester. So what are we finding? There's a tradition along Seymour Martin Lipset, who was a very influential political scientist / sociologist, wrote a very famous paper, Why No Socialism in the US. There's a very long tradition of comparing workers in the two countries. So in some ways, we revisit some of the questions he asked. And so we're done with the interviews in Manchester, New Hampshire. We did 45 interviews between May and December. So we interviewed them during the last electoral campaign. So, and we have coded them. So we have one paper. I'm going to present to you the result from this paper. Our colleagues in the UK were delayed. We have something called the Institutional Review Board for the Protection of Human Subject. And in the UK, there's huge bureaucracy, so they were very much delayed. But we know enough of what's coming up to tell, I can tell you right away, that there's very little connection between class identity and place identity in Manchester, New Hampshire. You interview the people we talk to, they know nothing about the history of the working class in New Hampshire. They have zero connection. Not only that, they don't know anything about working class politics. So you ask them, are you part of a union? They don't know what's a union. You ask them, you think of yourself, what social class do you think you are part of? They say, what's a social class? So the language has disappeared, whereas in the UK, that language is still very, very present. So we have a number of preliminary findings. One of them has to do with class moral boundaries. One could say American workers don't connect, they don't have a language for class politics anymore, but in fact they do. Their focus on corruption is an indication of this. They are extremely skeptical about politics. They think it's a shit show, it's drama. All the words they use are very negative words. Many of them want to protect themselves from politics by staying away from it. So this I interpret very much as moral boundaries toward the people in power. It is also often class boundaries. They think it's dishonest. Many of them want to stay away from it. So that would be a first, which is, very much. We have on another table, the list of words like corruption, polarization, huge, long list of negative words. When we code the positive word, there's 6 or 7 of them. So this is not a novel finding. There's a lot in political science about that in Europe and in the US. But it's interesting to think about this in terms of as a way, these people are often described as low information voters or non-voters who are not really engaging in politics seriously because they cannot explain to you in policy terms why they voted against Hillary or against Kamala. So one of the interviewers said, I voted against Kamala because I really didn't like her laugh. So, they don't offer what would be viewed as legit reason. But in fact, if you look at their moral boundaries, it's very much about politics, so you cannot disqualify what they're saying simply because they don't know about policy. You have to look at this much more closely. So we have a number of findings, preliminary findings here, that has to do really with their boundary patterns. They have great admiration for people above. They want to be rich. They love Trump in part because he's rich and successful, but they're very harsh toward people below, renters, people on welfare. There's a lot of drug addicts in Manchester, New Hampshire. And they embrace the American dream to the extent that they would say, yeah, of course I want to be rich. The idea that the American dream and symbolic citizenship are the same. And as I said earlier, they don't know what the working classes, those words, those questions mean nothing to them. And in terms of our other hypothesis, they don't know much about the place identity or about the history of workers. And a lot of people talk about nostalgia as an explanation for support for the radical right. Well, among these American workers, they're not really nostalgic because they don't know much about the history of the working class. I don't think the word nostalgia works very well there. So a paper that exists talks about 4 different paths for recognition. One is distance from politics. I'm going to stay away from it because the politicians couldn't care less about us. So therefore, I'm not going to honor them with my attention, F them. I'm just doing my thing. So that's very, very common. Maybe a third of our respondents do this. The other third are engaging in what we call recognition through exclusion, which is the Trumpians. They say that Trump gives them recognition. Trump listens to them. When they want Trump to support, guns, he was able to change his mind. So they really, we have a separate article that explains all that Trump did in the first presidential election to appeal to them, to tell them, you're hard workers, you're the backbone of America, you're screwed because of globalization and immigrants, I'm going to take care of that. Well, that's exactly what he's been doing. So they feel that he's taking care of them by not spending money on Ukraine or Gaza, by kicking the immigrants out because it's a moment of scarcity, so they want to keep all the resources for themselves. But it's recognition because they feel like Trump is their guy and is taking care of them. Another group, much, much smaller, is recognition through inclusion, and those are people who participate in politics by saying, for me, politics is about being altruistic and supporting people like me, often people of color, LGBTQI people, so they connected to their own identity. But this group was quite small, which surprised me because New Hampshire is a purple state, you know. Normally you would have, and the recognition by elevation, we don't discuss this in our paper, but it's people who define themselves as independent, who think of themselves as, you know, keeping their own judgment and not wanting to fall into a party. So we have hypotheses that basically have to do with boundary pattern that we're going to be exploring in the greater length, and which really where the concept of groupness is central to the conceptualization. How much the workers in the two countries are experiencing themselves as belonging to a group and what it means in terms of their recognition work. So as you know, there's an enormous literature on the rise of the radical right. It's a huge industry of people doing this here. But what we're trying to do here is really bring in the lens of a focus on working class culture that goes beyond, that really tries to tie their political views to how they think about their class identity. So this is collaborative work. So I think maybe the part on the urban-rural divide in Europe, basically I'll just say 2 words on this. In the EU as an annual quality of life survey, and I got together with these economists, Massimiliano Masciarini and Mary Hyland. They decided to insert in their survey questions on political recognition. Oops, this is not looking good. And you can see on this map that, you know, the region, like in the map of Italy here, in yellow is where the radical right did not go well in Italy. And anyway, basically the point of these maps is basically that there's a huge divide between support for that radical right is much stronger in rural areas than in urban areas. It's true whether you look at France, Italy, but we find in the survey that they conducted that they have these questions on recognition and the recognition gap in rural and urban areas with questions that try to tap specifically whether they find that they believe that the government cares about people like you. So it's all about dignity and recognition. And they did some fancy quantitative analysis that I'm not going to describe to find that, yes, absolutely. So it's kind of the goal of this paper, and it's written kind of for economists, was really to make people more aware that recognition is also driving politics in Europe and that there are things that can be done. So when in these interviews they find, for instance, that people in rural areas feel that the EU is not paying attention to them because they're subsidizing electric vehicle, and the electric vehicle are just too expensive for people like them. So they feel like a lot of the policies that are being promoted in Brussels are just not serving them, or that their digital connectivity is just terrible, which is yet one more example of the ways in which EU is not paying attention to rural population. So the takeaway, since my collaborators are EU employees, they say it's really important that rural residents should be involved in all stages of investment plan and that their specific need be much more taken into consideration if we want to stop this, you know, the support for radical right parties in rural areas. So as you can see, I'm giving you a lot here, but it's a way to really provide you like a little bit of a, you know, exposure to this research agenda that I've been conducting through different research projects. But this is all very much inside the sausage factory. The sausage is still being done. So I really look forward to your input and suggestions concerning especially the projects that are still in the making, and also the substantive questions, like what I said about hope, especially for students in the room. How do you react to this? Does it resonate with you? Do you see it? So I'll stop here, and I'll thank the various organizations that have funded this research, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.